Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second in a series of webinars on PFI Handback. I'm James Larmour. I'm a partner at Freeths specialising in PFI. Today, I'm joined by three brilliant guests from the wonderful world of PFI. Firstly, representing the public sector, we have Sara Humber, who's got a very long title, but I think Sarah's the commercial lead for the Welsh MIM Schools Initiative. Representing equity investors, we have Chris Field from Dalmore Capital. And finally, we have James Graham from ENGIE, who is representing the interests of FM contractors. So the purpose of today is to really explore the issues and challenges arising from PFI Handback from the perspective of the key stakeholders engaged in PFI. So we'll run through some questions and hopefully reach some helpful conclusions. As we said at the outset, if there's any questions you have, please add those to the chat function, and then I'll sift out the difficult ones, and we'll pick up the easy ones at the end. So I think before we get into the meter, it's probably the key question is who thought they'd ever be around for PFI Handback? I suppose, Chris, we've talked before. You engaged in some very early projects. What are your views on that?
So yeah, thanks for that, James. I guess when I first bumped into PFI in 1995, I was only 40, and therefore I did hope that I'd be around for expiry. Whether I'd be involved in expiry is perhaps a different question, because I'm not sure how much thought one gave to expiry way back when, and doubtless we'll talk about that a bit later. But I have to say that sort of my 25 years in PFI, I've done nothing since 1995. I hasten to add, has been very memorable. I still get a buzz from it every day, irrespective of the various challenges that it throws at us all. And actually, I've enjoyed, not surprisingly, given the number of years, some of the best moments of my working life doing this stuff.
Okay, Sara?
So not been doing it quite as long as Chris, but I suppose in the 18 years that I've been doing this, at the beginning, if I'm honest, I probably didn't think so much about Handback, but I suppose the position that I'm in at the moment, being the program director for a brand new program of PPP education facilities, is that it's very much in the forefront of my mind what we've actually embedded into our contracts in terms of the cradle to grave approach to PPP contracts. So our provisions in the MIM project agreement are pretty robust in terms of being very clear about what is expected at handback and expiry, and therefore, and we've embedded in provisions to ensure that that the public sector is properly contract managing the contracts through the process, and I think that's kind of key to the success or failure. So when you get to the end, that actually it's not a surprise and you're not scrabbling around looking for the contract, because actually you understand what assets you've got and you understand what's expected at the point in time that the facility's handed back. So no, we're doing all we can to make it right for the future.
Great, so it's good to hear. James, did you think you'd be around for Handback?
I suppose my introduction to PFI was a bit earlier. I think it was about 22 when I started my first PFI project. It hasn't aged me at all, but somewhat naively, I probably didn't even think about the concept of handback back then. So certainly not something that was entirely relevant in when facing sort of the immediate challenges. But probably for the last 2 to 3 years, it's probably been at the forefront of my mind.
Okay, yeah, increasingly moving up the agenda. So my next question was, what are you doing in your organisations to actively prepare for Handback? Sara, if I throw over to you, you've given us a bit of insight as to how you're perhaps learning some lessons from the earlier PPP deals where the Handback provisions weren't, as robust as they perhaps ought to be. Is there anything else you guys are looking at, or do you think there's anything the public sector should be doing right now to prepare?
I mean, I think anybody can read the PAC recommendations from to IPA and the requests that have been made in terms of how they're going to assist public authorities during this process. It's very clear that the 4 pillars are at the heart of what you need to consider in order to an expiry is actually quite a a successful process. All the public sector really needs to ensure is that it gets what it paid for, and I think that's what we're making. But by putting in place robust contract management, by making sure that the provisions are very express in terms of handback and the timing of surveys in relation to specific bits of kit, and other quality measures such as an independent M&E commissioning manager actually addressing that fault line at handover, which is the key point at which things that probably we might be suffering now in facilities that are being handed back, that actually those defects are addressed at the point in time that that building is handed over into the operational phase. And I think that we've spent a lot of time on the quality element with the clerk of works provision, the independent M&E commissioning manager, and a very robust scope for the independent tester. And hopefully that will future-proof these projects from from problems in the future.
That's so interesting. So you're dealing with it at the outset rather than waiting for the chickens to come home to roost.
Yeah.
James, what are ENGIE doing to actively prepare for handback?
Well, I think that the short answer probably is investing. So that's in creating a handback and expiry team, so that we kind of fully understand our contractual obligations against the 67 PFI contracts we have. I think I was pleased to hear Sara reference defects, clerk of work and quality. That's something that we are still working through on many operational PFIs today. The other area of investment is in communication and relationships, so engaging with the public sector, be that through the bodies such as IPA, SFT in Scotland and DFE, but also with clients and authorities. These contracts are long-term contracts. Being able to understand what the authorities' needs and wants are today, and whether actually the contract fits what they need and want, and how we can work together between now and expiry to deliver back an asset that essentially creates value for both the public and private sectors.
Okay, thank you, James. And Chris, what are Dalmore up to in terms of preparation?
Well, a quick observation on Sarah's submission there. I'm going to be 90 when Sarah's contracts expire, and whether I'll be around for those, but it's lovely to see that that clarity of thought is available now and will be available for people to look at when I either may have expired or may not have done. So because that lack of clarity, which I'm sure we'll come back to later, is an issue. So addressing your question specifically, James, what are we doing? A lot is the answer to your question. Let's just split it down into what we're doing strategically and what we're doing tactically. So from a strategic point of view, we're talking and preparing internally, including looking at best and worst practice that there is around. There's not a lot of expiry experience around at the moment, for obvious reasons, but we're certainly having a look at that. So we are talking and preparing ourselves internally with various strands. We're talking to IPA. James has already mentioned, that strategic discussion that we absolutely need to have between the private sector and the public sector. So we're talking to the IPA and various government departments on a sort of portfolio basis, as opposed to the tactical, which I'll come on to in a bit. We're talking to our management service providers. They've got views from across the industry clearly and have experience of expiry and views. So we're certainly talking to them, and fundamentally they're going to have to manage a lot of the process for investors. We'll get involved, but they're going to have to go and do the doing. So it's important that we keep them in the loop, up to speed, and all the rest of it. I and we're talking to our service providers as well. So James, we're talking to them individually, but we're setting an agenda at the moment for the discussion that we need to have strategically with them, as well as clearly the stuff on the ground. So that's what we're doing overall. Relatively early days. It's probably it's on our asset management team's agenda for monthly sessions, that's for sure, and in between those sessions we're learning and thinking and developing our way forward. So from that sort of strategic level, at a tactical level, I've got 3 projects that are currently on the expiry journey. 2 that are due to expire in the next 12 months, and another in 4 years' time. So we're dealing with those on an individual project basis. So we're not looking for one size fits all, because I'm not a believer in that. The rules of the game associated with each project, certainly the early ones, are very different. The 2 that I've got expiring in the next 12 months, one has bizarrely quite detailed handbag requirements, particularly for an early project, and the other one has next to nothing. So therein lies that different story. I have to say that at project level, both the 2 that are expiring in the next 12 months are going well. So that's good early experience for us. I suspect there'll be some turbulence. Well, there's already been a bit of turbulence along the way, but nothing that we can't cope with as a team on the ground. So you sort of, and actually one of those is in a sector that doesn't have a great deal of expertise, and the other one's in one that does. And we haven't needed to have recourse to any of the central bodies, if you will, which is encouraging, to be honest.
I guess this really leads into my next question: is what are the key challenges that people are going to face when it comes to handbag? Maybe I'm going to throw it over to James in the first instance.
Yeah, I think it's quite a broad question in terms of challenges. So at ENGIE, we're probably 4.5 years away from our first major handbag, and I think some of the challenges are kind of very practical. So it's about the availability of resource on the public sector side, but to think beyond the challenges that exist in the day-to-day operation of a PFI contract. So it's that availability of thinking and planning time. I think, though, increasingly we're probably starting to look at some of the more structural challenges in these deals, that as we approach handbag, the drivers between the private sector side are often different. Chris and I have touched on this before, so the different drivers between equity and FM approaching handbag, and clearly, ENGIE has a desire to provide services post PFI. The opportunities for investors beyond the expiry are fewer. So I think that there's some work to do and challenges. Whilst we've engaged very well with public sector bodies to make sure that we've got that same engagement and strategic approach on the private sector side as well.
Okay, maybe I'll throw it over to Chris to follow up on your previous discussions with James.
Yeah, no. So sorry, in terms of the biggest challenge, I'll pick up with James later in terms of that different opinion in terms of what opportunities perhaps there are out there. So I've got 3 things that in terms of challenges that I think are out there and need to be addressed. Managing expectations, the first one. Getting the various stakeholders to understand the rules and agree the rules of the game. So it goes back to my previous point about some contracts have those clearly articulated, which makes it a bit easier. Others don't, but that shouldn't stop us sitting down and having an adult discussion to agree what those rules of the game are. Needless to say, managing that expectation does involve addressing some stakeholders who may indeed wish to change the rules of the game at this stage, which of course will provide challenge. Already James has mentioned the R question, which is resources. I think that's a very significant issue for the public sector. It's an issue for the private sector as well. We'll talk about that perhaps a little later on. So for me, dealing with as many projects, 700 odd projects that the public sector has to deal with in terms of getting these through expiry is going to be a very significant challenge. And we'll talk about that more, I'm sure. Third, and by no means last, is trust. We are going to need to rebuild some trust that's been lost recently. The health sector has provided us with a pretty challenging environment over the last, I guess, both the private and the public sector over the past sort of 2 or 3 years. And I think there is certainly, we had an investor forum with the IPA, it must be about a month ago now, when that very subject came up very, very early on in terms of how that is being managed. I get that a lot of the challenges there are associated with compliance, and that's something that we absolutely do need to get right from a private sector point of view. But it's not difficult to see how that trust has been lost, and so we do need to help getting that back. I think a bit of that trust has not been helped by some of the aggressive questioning in the IPA health checks. I think that's some interesting questions in those health checks, and I think there's been some references in the PAC's report following their committee, published on the 15th of March, I think, ironically, the Ides of March, suggesting difficult investors are around. I'm interested to hear from somebody from the public sector who can describe and define what a difficult investor is. I think
Sara might have a go.
If it's an investor that wishes to stick by the rules of the game that were agreed 25 years ago, then I'm a difficult investor.
Well, should we bring in Sara?
Oh Lord,
what's a difficult And then more seriously, could you perhaps pick up on the resourcing issues for the public sector? I think that's going to be very key.
Yeah, so I suppose I won't slap Chris's wrists over the issue of transparency. I think we all agree that the world today around transparency and what is expected in terms of transparency is a very different world to what it was 20 odd years ago. Having said that, I do acknowledge quite a lot of the things that both Chris and James have said. I mean, the early contracts, there's a lack of handback provision in many cases, a lack of transparency, but there are also some odd things. So it's not very helpful to either party to have a lack of transparency and a lack of the handback provisions and what's required. But I maintain the principle of the public sector's approach should be that they are only interested in getting what they paid for, which is a well-maintained, whole life costed asset. Now, that I don't think is something that is missing from any of those early contracts. Now, it might be that the facility is not entitled to a replacement boiler at the end of the term, but actually we need evidence that that boiler has been adequately maintained with the adequate parts and all sorts of things like that. So I think in terms of just sort of rolling back from those initial issues, the key challenges are, I believe, resourcing, as you've all said, on the public sector side. I think that the gauntlet that's been thrown down from the PAC report to IPA is, how are you going to ensure that the expiry and handback of these contracts is adequately resourced? And I think that there are pockets of excellence in central government departments, and there are pockets of excellence in local authorities, for example. I mean, I'm particularly focused on schools because that's the area I've been working in, but just as example, there's 173 contracts, there's 750 to 800 schools under PFI arrangements, and of those 173 contracts, 168 are with local authorities. So there's got to be a concerted effort on the public sector side to deploy resource that's experienced and capable to actually assist in those discussions. But these are discussions about, let's frame the conversation that we're going to have, let's understand the contract that we've got, and let's make a decision about how we're going to move forward. Because the last thing you want is to get yourself into a situation where you've got the kind of PFI ambulance chasers acting for the public sector, making large deductions which are almost diverting away from the discussion that needs to be had about the state of the asset. Having said that, there will be assets that have been extremely poorly maintained, where people have pilfered the life cycle fund, and you've got to be really careful about those in situations like that, that will be exposed, and that where you haven't had, I don't know, you've got an air handling unit that's switched off, or you've got sports drainage that's never worked, you've got all of those items, you need to right the ship first before you can even have the discussion about handback. And I think that's why you need to get in sort of 5 years before with the survey, but also frame the discussion. Don't say we're entitled to everything being new as the public sector. Let's assess the asset, and let's make sure that the public sector has got what they paid for. Not any more, but just exactly what they paid for. And I think that's absolutely key.
Absolutely. Superb.
You're not meant
Excellent.
to agree.
Chris agrees with me.
I brought you along to have a fight, not to agree with each other.
Great articulation of where we need to get to as a private sector. I get that. As I said, compliance is it's not an optional. We've got to get compliant. It's as simple as that. But actually sitting down early, understanding, getting people to understand, managing those expectations, absolutely critical.
I think the one point I would add is kind of to pick on Sarah's example of the assets on handback is, are they entitled to a new gas boiler? I think one of the things that the private and public sector do better is actually work out what the best asset to be replaced is, i.e. does that gas boiler need to be replaced with a ground source heat pump? How are these assets going to achieve net zero? So if we focus too much on what the contract says today and harking back to performance mechanism that may have been set 15, 20 years ago, it may drive a worse outcome for the public sector, because that asset may not be handed back with the right set of modern technology on the road to net zero, whereas finding the right collaboration and transparency that you talked about, Sarah, will allow that to happen. And I think the nervousness in some of the PFI contracts at the moment is that that transparency will lead to those big deductions and those challenges. And I think there's a lot of work that collectively we need to do between the private and public sector to create that culture that allows transparency and allows us to say, okay, the contract requires X, but you might want to do something slightly different if it provides a better outcome for both the public and private sector.
That's a very good point, James.
Yeah.
So just a couple of quick answers on, I'd see a couple of Q&As come in. What's IPA? The Infrastructure and Projects Authority, which is the sort of central government organisation that looks after big stuff and is Cabinet Office Treasury based. So there you go.
Can we? I think we were moving on. We're touching on disputes, weren't we? Is something that could fall out of handback. Views on how to avoid disputes, or indeed whether we do need to avoid disputes. Do you have a view on that, Chris?
Yes. So I think we're gonna sort of in danger of repeating ourselves lots of times, but that's why it's important. So for me, talking early at all levels. So absolutely critical to make sure that people understand what the rules of the game are. And if there are disagreements with that, then we need to sort those out. The earlier that we do that, the better. Nothing worse than getting to the altar and finding out we've got a load of problems. Does that need to be 7 years? Sort of the 7-year itch, as I've called it, I think emerged out of the NAO, the National Audit Office's report last year, which recommended that 7 years was the right time to start. I think probably on the public sector side, it probably is. It's probably a little bit early. I think I heard Sarah suggest sort of 5 years or whatever. I think that's probably more realistic than the 7, but let's not argue about it. Talking early, is going to be absolutely critical. Getting that early agreement in terms of what the rules of that game are, the survey process, which I think we'll come back to a little later. Making sure that reasonable compliance is a given. In terms of, I think fair play to Sarah, she did acknowledge that I think that there has been some unreasonable assessment of compliance going on in one or two, no, more than one or two examples. So I think that's, as I say, that is actually a given. I think best avoiding disputes does bring back the resources question. Sorry to mention it again. Without those resources, I think you almost inevitably end up with disputes, and it's very, very difficult to have a collaborative approach to this stuff. And I'm not sure we've mentioned the collaborative word yet, but sort of having a collaborative approach to this, which is absolutely required if the resource, the other side of the table, is either A, not there, or B, is out of its depth through no fault of its own. So the resource challenge is huge.
James, do you have a view on disputes, avoiding them, or indeed whether you think they're necessary?
I think I would agree actually with a lot of what Chris has said. It is about engagement, understanding what the contract says, and resourcing. There will be some crunch questions in there. There will be some disagreements about what those handback provisions mean, especially where they aren't clear. But I think in some cases that either the public or private sector shouldn't be afraid of dispute. So the contracts have those mechanisms in them to be used. And I think that actually we shouldn't be afraid to use them to the extent that we can't reach agreement, and we've reached the end of the road insofar as collaborative discussion. But we all have those contracts that have got really explicit and well-defined handback obligations, but probably got more that in fact have much more loosely defined handback obligations. And I think we're going to have some challenges working through what they really mean with the public and private sector. And so the final answer really is we shouldn't be afraid of dispute as a last resort to help us reach the right answer.
Yeah, I guess the key issue there is just trying to narrow down the scope of the areas of dispute, isn't it? Work out what's agreed and then focus on the areas in contention.
It is, and I think Chris, the debate about how early is too early to engage. I think we're looking to try and sit down and have a good understanding with our clients 9 years ahead of handback where possible for all of our contracts, because the reality is, the reality is that actually time moves very quickly. The resources aren't always available, and these things take a long time to work through, given the level of detail that's required.
Yeah,
Sarah? Sorry, Sarah. There's a cracking question come in, in relation to information handover at Handback, and what's going to happen when that's not available. Well, there you go. We're going to we're addressing that question. Certainly on the two projects that are expiring the next 12 months, we've addressed that question. We've sat down and agreed what that list of information, data, and all the rest of it is required, what format it needs to be in, and all the rest of it. So absolutely get the point, and it needs to be done early and agreed. Then just deliver the information, put it in a box, and if it ain't there and you've previously agreed you're going to provide it, it's going to be a bit difficult to dispute it. Sorry, Sarah, I interrupted your...
No, that's fine. So I suppose I absolutely agree that it's a resourcing issue. Certainly that there needs to be a credible counterparty on the public sector side in order to have these commercial discussions, because they can often be quite complex. And if the view is of the public sector coming to the table that the private sector's just naughty and trying to get one over on them, then actually that's not a very good place to start. I think the private sector's got the ability to take the heat out of how these discussions commence in terms of actually trying to frame the conversation in a collaborative way. I think collaboration is at the heart of it, but the people with the requisite skills and expertise have to sit on both sides of the table. And unfortunately, that resource on the public sector side is quite hard to come by, and there aren't very many individuals who who are capable of having those commercial discussions. I mean, there are all sorts of things where the private sector could potentially take advantage. You need of early contracts. You also need to have the requisite skills to understand that some of those contracts that don't have handback provisions also don't protect the private sector under the sole remedy provision, and all sorts of things. So you really do need to have somebody with the requisite expertise. And if they aren't within the public sector, which they generally, it's unusual within departments to actually have PPP experts. I think it's probably fair to say that there are kind of quite a few layers of checkers before you actually get to the people who actually do the work, which is not particularly helpful, because actually in order to attract those type of people into the public sector departments, you need to acknowledge the commercial specialist role, which is something that's available in the civil service, but it's not something that is broadly appreciated or viewed as necessary. Of course, the alternative, which is where you end up, is employing expensive lawyers like James in order to deal with these problems, which obviously, and you know, expensive consultants. But the truth is that the public sector needs to bolster its resources. We need to have informed commercial collaborations on these projects, or we will descend into a situation of costly disputes where only the lawyers win again. And I can say that because I am one. I'm just not one like you anymore. But so you just don't want, you really don't want these things to descend into dispute. But equally, I agree that if you can't actually come to agreement on a particular point in order to then going to expert determination or going to something like that to actually agree the status of the asset, or you know, whether or not that asset register and the maintenance records do represent what you're faced with, then I agree that it can be useful, but it is certainly the last resort. And I would never want it to be right, we're going into the boxing ring, let's have a big scrap, because it's just going to end up in disaster, and we're going to end up with projects expiring and nothing being agreed, which is you know, and also then a huge burden coming back to the public sector in terms of backlog maintenance, which should have been addressed by the private sector during the contract term.
Yeah, I think that could be the worst of worlds for everybody, not to have not to have a nice line in the sand when you get to expiry, and have disputes hanging out there.
I was going to, isn't it? So just one thing that I've reminded me is when, you know, the bell curve of expiry that is facing us all is going to ramp up pretty quickly, and that same bell curve, of course, was evident all those years ago when these projects were being bid. And of course, each department at that stage had its own private finance unit, which did house that expertise to be able to deliver help and advice to all and sundry to deliver. Now, whether that was successful or not, I don't know. I'll leave others to decide whether that was the case. But certainly the plea is coming through. You've only got to look at Leeds City Council's evidence to the PAC and Wiltshire Council's evidence as well, you know, almost pleading for resource to be made available in some form. And just on the disputes point, I did notice it again that sort of IPA are looking at some sort of dispute protocol associated with, so it's referenced in the PAC Public Accounts Committee report. So I've not seen evidence of that. I don't know whether that's actually coming forward or not. James, do you know? Or?
I've not seen anything.
No, okay.
Other James?
No, I haven't seen anything.
Okay, so we'll see.
I wanted to ask Sarah, what do you think the private sector should be doing now to help the public sector? And then maybe I'll bring in James and Chris to respond to what you think they should be doing.
Well, I think that the private sector should, looking at the buildings that are being handed back, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps do a little bit of an assessment of where those facilities are in terms of, have you got an asset register? Have you maintained that facility? Is it actually compliant? And prepare to actually take a good look at the standard that building has been maintained to. There's clearly evidence that there's quite a lot of buildings that are close to Handback that are not actually even compliant with fire stopping, fire dampers, no access hatches for cleaning, as I said before, AHU units switched off. Prepare to be able to report on the status of the asset, and accept that is that if you haven't perhaps been maintaining the asset to the standard that is required under the 5-year maintenance plan, or if there isn't one, the annual maintenance plan, and you don't have adequate records, that you actually need to step up to the plate and start doing something about it as soon as possible. Because I think if the resourcing is provided, it'll probably make it much easier for you when when the survey finally comes to happen, and actually you've got a good set of records about how that asset has been maintained. So I think that's the first position, and also just be prepared to come to the table to have an open and honest discussion about what's the way forward. That was what's happened. We are where we are. We can't do anything about it. Maybe we could have done it better on both sides of the table. Maybe the public sector could have managed the contract a bit better and held you to account more during the term of the contract. But let's look at where we are now and where we are going forward, but be prepared to provide that evidence supporting how that building has been maintained.
James, do you have a response to that?
I think a lot of comments are pretty fair, really, and I think that assessment of compliance, if you like, is kind of the route we're taking as an FM provider. I think that there are a couple of points that I'd make in a bit more detail. So one is probably around the standards of maintenance. So what are the standards? So that the change in law provisions, changes in HTMs, British standards. All of those things are being picked up, and I think in one of our discussions that we've had previously, we've talked about good industry practice. And so I think one of the things before we make that assessment of condition is to agree with the public sector what the criteria for that assessment of compliance is, because there's little value in the private sector carrying out that assessment unless the baseline's agreed. And so I think there's a bit of work to do before we get to that point, which is agreeing on what standards to which we are maintaining the building to, and to make sure that perhaps the public sector isn't maybe stretching some of those through interpretation of good industry practice and some of those earlier contracts that have got that looser drafting definition. That said, though, I think it is right that we should be out there having that compliance assessment, understanding what's been done. I think the point you made again, Sarah, again is right, and the transparency point that I'm strongly supportive of is really important. Is how we find a constructive way to do that. The IPA health checks that have been undertaken recently. It's going to be really interesting to see what the output of those health checks are, where that information goes, and how both the public and private sector can use that feedback to improve the handback process. What I wouldn't want to happen is for transparency and that open discussion now to lead into a sort of a spiral of challenge on the operational PFI contract. We've got to remember there are people delivering services at the front of this that we've got to remember, perhaps the often forgotten part of PFI contracts, that the people who've been either transferred from the public to private sector delivering those services, who are also looking at expiry, wondering what that impact will have on their roles and their jobs and who they might transfer to next. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, desperate to dive in.
I wasn't telling you to stop. I was going to just say, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So you referenced their transparency and the health checks and what happens next. Guess what? I've asked for a copy of the health check on the first project that's gone through. And what do you think the answer is?
Certainly not, Chris.
There you go. Full stop.
Yeah.
You can't have a copy of it. Okay, that's helpful. I'm not sure where
but I think
the trust point.
Exactly. So I think I think we've got some work to do, and the reality is, I think I understand why they might be so nervous from the IPA, but I think as a private sector, we've got to be able to demonstrate that we'll listen to the feedback, because I think we all be relatively naive if we said that we didn't have any PFI contracts that didn't have issues. These are long-term contracts that have been operational. The way in which they've been operated over time has perhaps deviated from what the contract intended. So we know there's a challenge to overcome, and I think that the sooner we can start to talk about it openly, the better. And I think if we need to ensure there is a level of trust, both the private sector trust in the public sector and the public sector trust in the private sector.
Yes, two-way street. Yep.
So maybe if I can just flip that previous question on its head and ask Chris and James what they think the public sector should be doing now to facilitate Handback and to help the private sector to deliver, and then maybe Sara can critique it. So Chris, maybe you could kick off.
Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? I don't know how many times I've said resources. So let's not cover it. But absolutely, it is a key to what the public sector should be doing to facilitate Handback. Full stop. Simple as. And the other one is stick to the rules of the game. I've mentioned that before. So we agreed something 25 years ago. We've been managing our investors' expectations in that 25-year period, and we need to continue to do that. So we need to be delivering Handback in accordance with those requirements, not today's wish list. So there has been already in some of the strategic discussions I've had some creep associated with that, and almost openly. You go, well, ouch. So that's presenting some challenges, and it does therefore sort of lead you to the point where the transparency that maybe is the definition of, or the lack of transparency that's definition of a difficult investor, is the reason why that transparency maybe is not coming forward, because you go, oh, hold on a minute, you're actually trying to change the rules of the game. And you're going to use whatever information we give you to deliver your wish list for today. And I go, I'm not sure that I can live with that.
I guess that maybe feeds into the point that James was making earlier around, maybe future-proofing items when you replace them in preparation for Handback. But obviously that would not be in the original spec. James, do you have a view on what the public sector should be doing now to help you with your job?
I think the biggest question that we would like the public sector to answer, is probably what are their plans for that asset post expiry. So, as a service provider, kind of touched on earlier, we are, clearly and fairly obviously, wanting to retain an element of that client base and to provide services, and clearly think we can add value. At the moment, all of the thinking around expiry appears to go up into midnight on the day of expiry, and we haven't really extended that thinking to what happens next, what around re-procurement. I did touch briefly a minute ago on people. There are a huge number of people employed on some of these PFI contracts that are grouped together. A quick example, multi-schools contracts where we've got a significant number of schools. Engineers are operating efficiently across a number of schools, but post expiry, they'll go back to either various academies or authorities. And so there are some big people implications on expiry that I think we need to think about as well. And so therefore the question I said is, what are the plans post PFI, post expiry? And that's, I think, what the public sector could help us with in planning.
Sara?
So I'm going to pull it right back and say we're at the moment in time, we need some serious strategic thinking from central government about where the resources sit and where the budget's coming from and how those resources are applied at a local level. Now, this is obviously happening in terms of the 4 pillars, the IPA and the PAC report. I think that the key thing is around they've got to make a fundamental decision as to where the resource will sit. Is it going to sit centrally in IPA? And are the people who are the commercial specialists within IPA going to go out, roll their sleeves up and get involved with these contracts at a local level and provide that resource? Or is that going to be is that going to be consultants? Is it going to be delivered via local partnerships, resource? And so where actually is that resource going to sit, and how is it going to be funded, and how is it going to get in its most experienced level down to the local contracts to actually assist those people on the ground? And I think the queries raised in the PAC for IPA actually do address quite a lot of that, but it needs really detailed strategic thinking and budgetary decisions, that the money is actually going to be spent on the right level of resource. And I come back to the commercial specialist role, looking at the expiry and the just going back to the sort of DFE number of contracts, 173 contracts. When the bell curve reaches its height, that the chances are, you're going to need 20-25 experts to help with that sort of work. It's not the train is coming now. It left the station a while ago, so it's got to happen now. And rather than kicking the can down the road, the public sector's got it's really reached that fulcrum where it's got to make that decision, and it's got to put its money where its mouth is, effectively. So I think James's point is a really interesting point, and I think that maybe we should consider that more thoroughly as the public sector, because perhaps it's something that's not been discussed sufficiently or considered sufficiently, because actually we're just kind of looking, it's coming, it's going to expire, eek, what's going to happen? But we've not thought about the fact that there could be some really nice dovetailing of services, that there could be some retrofitting of ground source heat pumps, for example, air source heat pumps. I mean, the first school that we're delivering in Wales is going to be a net zero carbon pilot, so we're building a school, hopefully, that will be net zero carbon in operations, but we're not considering perhaps all the implications of all those public buildings that need to be targeting net zero carbon, and all of those opportunities out there. And I've probably ruined one of the next questions by saying that, but I do agree with you, James. I think you do need. I think the public sector does need to have discussions with companies about the future FM provision, and those personnel that are working on the ground, and what their future holds.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
We've got a flurry of questions on the Q&A, which I'd like to get to. I'd start to finish up kind of the main part with just a question to all of you as to what you think a good outcome would look like in terms of PFI Handbag. Maybe we're going to throw that over to Chris.
Again, I like splitting these things down into threes. Political speakers tend to do these things. So early agreement on the rules of the game is, for me, a good outcome. Certainly looks like that, and will deliver, I think, a good outcome. Close management of the process. Once you've actually agreed what the rules of the game are, and then worked out with your public sector partner what process we need to go through to get there, then is actually actively managing that along the way. And I have to say, both of the projects that I've got expiring in the next 12 months, that's been very, very well articulated, both using one contract that has very clear provisions and the other which doesn't. And actually we've agreed what's needed, and now it's just a question of going through and delivering it. So for me, that's been great experience, and it seems to be working. And I guess the best thing is soft landings for everyone is for me the third outcome. Whether that's from everybody's perspective, and picks up James's point, and I recognise there is a difference. Well, one of the challenges that we do have is there are different incentives around here. So James has a very active interest in that transition and continuity, if you like, from a business perspective from his point of view. Likewise, the public sector clearly has that in terms of no disruption to teaching of kids and all that sort of stuff. From an investor perspective, I've seen little imaginative thinking coming forward, either internally or externally, as to how we might be involved in investing in these assets post expiry in some way. There are some projects that have residual value issues, opportunities, if you like, or requirements in them in terms of property, but they're pretty limited. And given the landscape and the bashing that PFI has taken over the years, I'm not sure too many people would be interested in listening to imaginative proposals in any event. So for me, soft landings for everyone, please.
Okay. James?
I suppose if I were to try and simplify it, I think what good looks like in terms of expiry is that a compliant asset that's handed back, that's fit for the future, that is digital decarbonised, and there are ongoing service provisions, for service providers to add value to the public sector for future years.
Okay, thank you. Sarah?
As far as from the public sector perspective, I think the good outcome is that the public sector has handed back an asset that has been maintained in accordance with the contract, and in many cases to a very good standard, a compliant asset, because the implications of those assets coming back, for example, to DFE, already has a huge issue of backlog maintenance in schools that aren't in a good condition, is very serious. It's it's 750, 800 assets landing back into, and a lot of them have been academised. There'll be a draw on the academy maintenance fund. So I think that's a real risk. So a good outcome is handing back assets in good condition that are compliant. And as James said, if there are opportunities to make them more energy efficient, then all well and good. But I think one thing that we fail to do in this country, there's an opportunity here, and that's actually celebrate some of the successes. Now, it might be that they're few and far between in these early days.
Needs to be more positive, Sarah.
But where there's been a study in Germany that has identified that PPP assets have been handed back, are in much better condition than capital assets because of the ongoing maintenance regime. If we can make a good news story out of this, then there are, I think there may be opportunities for the future, but everybody has to learn their lesson from the things that have gone wrong and bad practice. And that's kind of at the core of everything that I've done running a new program, is that I've honed what we did before. We've learned lessons from all of our experiences, and we've tried to embed as much clarity in the contractual arrangements as possible. But I think we should identify successes where we can, and we should celebrate them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually, one of the outcomes of Handback could be vindication of the model, ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely spot on.
We've got a whole shed load of questions, some of which are essays. So I'll try and rattle, if we can try and get through some succinct answers, and we can try and rattle through as many as we can. There's an awful lot of questions around what's happening post expiry. So maybe I'll just squish that down into a general question to the panel. If there are any views as to what's going to happen to assets post expiry, and or how the public sector might best manage them.
Yeah, let me chip in just a quickie. So for me, I think we should again celebrate some success, because I think the IPA's start with the health check is a good one, and that health check includes a whole section on prompting the public sector as to what are they going to do with the asset after expiry. So I think there is some really good thinking gone on there. Doesn't particularly interest me as an investor, but I'll certainly acknowledge and respect it. There's no question of that at all. But so there is some good work gone on there.
Okay, James, I think you've got some views as to
how
these assets should be managed.
I think I said, it's good to say to the IPA health check, just prompt that thinking. I think we really need to work quickly to develop that thinking into action as to what are these assets going to be used for. I do think that some of that post PFI thinking will inform the strategy for expiry. But for us, I think, it's all about looking to the value that the private sector can add and beyond expiry in terms of services. So I know Chris has said limited opportunities for investors, but these assets will continue to need investment and life cycle funds, and some of that life cycle money won't be immediately available to the public sector. So I think we need to think about how not only we have these assets back, but keep them in condition B or in good standard for future years, that they do last many years to come.
Sarah, another challenge for the public sector and planning for post-expiry.
Yeah, I think I agree really with James. I think we should look at this in a positive way as an opportunity for the future, albeit that there's not much in it for Chris, but he'll get other chances. But I think that it is an opportunity. I suppose there's a at the point in time that the contract comes to an end, that there is more flexibility for the facility to make change, for them to make changes to the facility without being tied to the change protocol, or in the early contracts probably just a discussion about what you were going to do and how much it was going to cost. But I think that there are many more opportunities for the facility to be flexed to suit changes to say learning and education, or changes to the way in which health is delivered. So there are opportunities, and those opportunities for the private sector to to help, especially when they know the asset, are limitless, really.
Thank you. So another question is quite interesting, and I think it's something which is something we have to do, is how can we best learn from the early handbacks and then translate that learning into the handback of projects when we get up that bell curve? How can we deploy the knowledge we've gained from the early handbacks?
I mean, I think it'd be really important for departments to actually draft guidance notes to help and share them and agree them with the private sector in terms of how you frame the conversations from the early stages of handback, so that there's almost like a protocol that sits around, if there's no handback provisions, what do you do? How do you frame the conversation? What do you need to get? What do you need to see? What should be available? What are the parameters of the maintenance regime? Was it a 1-year maintenance plan? Was there a 5-year maintenance plan? Where does the life cycle fund sit? I mean, there's some contracts where they sit with the authority, which again, it's sort of slightly odd in our world now, but there are odd contracts and odd arrangements. So I think, make sure you understand how it's been framed and I think protocols and draft protocols to help would be really useful going forward.
I agree. I do think the IPA has a role to play in terms of sharing that feedback and those protocols, or the relevant body of XSFT, Scotland, etc. I think sharing what good looks like and being able to define that, and so there's consistency. It is where there's real value to be added. What would be a challenge is, if we didn't take any of that learning, we had consistent repeated discussions and/or points being debated on individual projects, and the public sector got a myriad of different answers from the private sector. So I do think there is a role there for centre to play in helping to set those protocols and helping to facilitate that information share and learning.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And Sarah, your point is really pertinent for me. That should be a combined effort. So we've got good practice going on. Let's not just have it coming out as public sector. Let's recognise it as a collaborative approach that's gone well. And these are the things that they did. And in fact, I've got sort of fingers crossed on one of the projects that we could actually use that as a case study when it does expire and everyone has a soft landing, is to go out there and tell people about it, because that's got a bit of residual value property in it, as well as all the other handback issues that we've been talking about in terms of information and data transfer, as well as the condition of the asset. So yeah, agree with all of that.
Okay, should we just squeeze in one last question? I'm being told we're out of time, but I'm going to be a rebel. This is quite an interesting point. Comparing the condition between D&B and PFI assets procured under BSF would be a good measure of performance of PFI. Discuss.
Sorry, say that again.
Comparing the performance of D&B schemes procured under BSF as
So
against
design and
PFI
build.
schemes. Yeah. So you straight D&B schemes under BSF scheme.
Yes.
As compared to a fully fledged PFI.
Yeah, I'm not.
That would demonstrate possibly that PFI is a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, interesting. I've got some D&Bs on one BSF that have actually got FM contracts in them for a 25-year term, which is quite interesting with the life cycle pot shared between the service provider and the authority. Obviously, James nodding. Maybe he's got one or two.
Yeah.
As well. Crikey, PFI contracts include a design and build contract, so I'm not sure there's too much difference in terms of specification setting.
It'll be around the FM piece, I guess.
The requirement is so. Yeah.
We've got an example where we have a 25-year PFI BSF deal and a D&B about 100 meters apart. We no longer have the D&B, and it would be really interesting to go and do a condition survey on those two assets at the end of the term just to see the difference. Clearly, I'm fairly confident the level of life cycle spend on the D&B asset is significantly lower, and therefore that asset lasts as long. Perhaps not, but it's an interesting question, and I guess my gut tells me you probably find that the PFI asset had a longer residual life left in it on the expiry of 25 years than a D&B asset that had not been maintained in the same way.
You'd certainly hope so. Sarah, any views?
Yeah, I agree, actually. I think you need to be careful because a lot of the BSF contracts, as Chris said, that they often came with FM. So you need to make sure that you look at the ones that didn't have an FM contract associated with them. But I agree that comparison could be really telling. And again, we could produce something like the German survey, which actually identifies that there is, consider the assets in considerably better condition, because ultimately we want these assets to reach at least their design life and not just survive for 25 years before they fall down. So we don't want to reward failure on the capital side of infrastructure, do we, by just giving more capital out when the building ceases to be in good condition anymore.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well, I sense we could probably talk about this a lot longer. Certainly I could, but unfortunately we are out of time. So thank you to the panelists and thank you to all the attendees. And the recording will be on YouTube.